Tā ir pienācis laiks mūsu pēdējam ziņojumam šajā konferencē, un tā autors ir TILMANs Plaths. TILMANs Plaths ir vēstures zinātņu doktors, Ziemeļu valstu vēstures viesprofesors Greifsvaldes Universitātē, Berlīnas Humboldt Universitātes Ziemeļu valstu institūta pasniedzējs un daudz publikāciju autors. TILMANa Platha pētījumi koncentrējās uz Ziemeļa Eiropas un Austruma Eiropas vēsturi no 18. līdz 20. gadsimtam, kā arī uz starpnacionālajām attiecībām Baltijas jūras reģionā. Viņš ir pētījis arī Krievijas 18. gadsimta tirzniecības un ekonomiskās domāšanas vēsturi, un jāteic, ka nesen Rīgā lasījis lekciju Pagātne, kas negrib aiziet, holokausts Latvijā, mūsdienu vācu historiogrāfijā. Un šajā konferencē TILMANs Plaths prezentēs ziņojumu Karību salas Baltijas jūrā, atceroties koloniālo pagātni pilsētas muzejos, Flensburgas un Ventspils salīdzinājums. Lūdzu.
Jā, paldies par uzaicinājums. Es vienmēr labprāt esmu viesis šeit Rīgā, šeit Latvijā. Jā, un I hope that towards the end of the conference you still have enough strength to follow my talk into a completely different topic. Towards the end of the conference, as we heard, I'm going to speak about the Caribbean and the Baltic, commemorating the colonial past in Flensburg and Ventspils in the Maritime Museum in Flensburg and the Castle Museum in Ventspils, respectively. So it's, I hope, going to be an interesting topic. And this is my structure. At the beginning, I will lay out my initial thoughts and explain a little bit why I came to this topic. As you have noticed, it's not so much my main topic of research, actually. Then I will follow into a very similar, very easy structure, simple structure. I will start with a very brief overview of the colonial past of the city of Flensburg, with regard to the colonial possessions in the Caribbean, and after that discuss or lay out the commemoration in the city and the museum in Flensburg, and I will do the same respectively with regard to Ventspils. So in the beginning, Ventspils and its colonial past on Tobago, as you of course know, and then what is shown and what we can see in Ventspils and the Castle Museum with regard to this topic, and then towards the end, of course, a conclusion as a kind of comparison of these two cases. Yeah. So let's start with an introduction. Why I chose especially Flensburg and Ventspils. I think these two cities are quite interesting and comparable because both cities were major port cities of colonial enterprises, located in the Baltic Sea region, and both of medium size, not that much huge cities, and more important also not the capitals of the respective countries. And also additionally the respective colonial powers were comparably small, of course. Denmark on the one hand and Kurland, of course, on the other, even smaller, possibly the smallest colonial power which existed. So this is quite similar, and another aspect is also, I think, similar or very interesting when speaking about the memory politics, memory culture today, is the fact that both cities are nowadays located in states which are not in a legal tradition to the former colonial power. Flensburg is, as we know, located nowadays in Germany, and Germany was not possessing the Danish colonies. And on the other hand, of course, Latvia is also not it's a different case, of course, but also not the real legal predecessor of Kurland. So the frame of commemorating is located into another state nowadays. That makes it also interesting to compare these two cities. and to ask for the representation of this past in the museum. As I said, it's one museum at the Maritime Museum in Flensburg, this one here, founded in 1984. And on the other hand, the Castle Museum, you probably know, in Ventspils, opened in 2001. Yeah, and the question also with the whole topic, I think, is the very basic question. I have to confess that I'm, of course, an historian, not a museologist, and that's why I'm a little bit maybe naive approaching to this topic, but still I think the very reason or aim of the museum is also the question of my talk, what the museum actually wants to achieve within the society, just showcasing documents and educating the population of society, or even being part of a social change, as Richard Sandel has it, as an agent of social change, a little bit more like a museum activism, which would be possible within a museum. That's this background, which was interesting for me to pose these questions. So I come to the Flensburg and the Danish West Indies. As you see on the slides, this is just a brief overview to have in comparison also the time frame. The Danish colonies started to develop, or the Danes started to establish colonies towards the end of the 17th century in 1671 on St. Thomas. You see it here, the Caribbean Sea. These three islands are located here. This is St. Thomas, 1671, as I said. A little bit later, in the beginning of the 18th century, St. John, just the neighbor island. And finally, 1733, the Danes bought from the French St. Croix, which is the largest one in the south here, and which is the one where most of the plantations were working, and that's why slave work of slaves were very important on this island, St. Croix especially. And with regard to Flensburg, it's interesting that the real participation of the city of Flensburg started only in the middle of the 18th century, since, as you might know, Flensburg was part of the Schleswig-Holstein region, which was only partially belonging to Denmark, and therefore only in the middle of the 18th century the monopoly of the Danish crown's ceased to exist, or the Danish merchant company ceased to exist in the middle of the 18th century, and it was opened up for all inhabitants of the so-called Danish, not empire, but the Danish unitary state, which was founded a little bit later. But anyway, also the inhabitants of Schleswig and Holstein could participate in the colonial trade in the middle of the 18th century, and that's why the starting point of Flensburg's participation was in 1755 by the foundation of Flensburg merchants in the Company of St. Croix. And this was very successful on behalf of the Flensburg merchants, and the city really very actively participated in a trade with the Danish Virgin Islands, and the main commodities were sugar. Sugar was transported from the Caribbean Sea to Flensburg, and this is why Flensburg became a major center of the rum production. And this is really, up to now, a very integral part of the identity of the whole city. Maybe some of you have been to the city, and you would immediately notice that this is really a very. But it's also important, of course, that so the Flensburg merchants were sailing from Flensburg to the Caribbean, but were not actively participating in the slave trade from Africa to the Danish so-called West Indies. Only indirectly profiting from this slave trade, because, as I said, on St. Croix, all this workforce, of course, came from Africa. And in total, 100,000 slaves had been transported from Africa to the Danish Virgin Islands. And with regard to the story of slavery, it's interesting to note that as a result of Enlightenment discussions, Denmark was the first country to abolish slave trade, and the decision was taken in 1792, but it was implemented only 10 years later in 1803. And the slavery itself on the islands was abolished half a century later as a result of an insurrection in 1848 by Peter von Scholz, and the governor of the Danish, the Virgin Islands. And then again, with regard to Flensburg, of course, we must not forget that Flensburg was part of the Danish unitary state, but as a result of the Danish-German War of 1864, the Prussians and the Austrians won the war against Denmark, and as a result, Schleswig and Holstein became part of Prussia first, and later, of course, a few years later, of course, of the German Empire. But this did not stop the colonial tradition of the city, because after that, Flensburg lost the contact to the Danish Virgin Islands, but continued to import sugar via Jamaica, and so the rum production continued to exist also afterwards. And with regard to the Danish Virgin Islands, they were sold only in 1917. In between, there had been a very important, for the Danish colonial history, important insurrection in 1878. And as I said, then in the course of the First World War, it was sold to the US. And now let's have a look on the commemoration. Here I start with the first slide. This picture is from the Maritime Museum in Flensburg. And this is just a short reminder that I always speak about Denmark, of course, but actually in historical terms it was not the small nation state like today, but as I mentioned, the so-called unitary state, which was, of course, much larger. Mainly Norway, of course, were part of it, Greenland, Iceland, and all the other colonies, not only in the Caribbean Sea, but also in the Indian Ocean, of course, also belong to the Danish unitary state. And this is also, as I said, part of the museum, which I'm going to show you a little bit later as well. Now okay. Yeah, and as I said, very important when speaking about commemorating the colonial past in Flensburg, it's all about rum. As I said, Flensburg is really presenting itself as a rum city. So if you like rum, I can recommend you to be a tourist or to visit the city. There's each year, even today, the so-called rum regatta. It's a sail contest of traditional sailing boats, very nice, by the way, every summer, and it's a huge festival. Lots of tourists are coming and celebrating this regatta in the city. But late in 2010, approximately, a more critical approach started to develop, and mainly in this Maritime Museum, everything started with a new exhibition, a new permanent exhibition in 2012. 3 rooms of the museum are dedicated to the colonial past of the city. I will show them a little bit later. And the real breakthrough, one might say, of the whole issue started with a special exhibition in 2017, Rum, Sweat, Tears, by Jamaicanian scholar. And this was really a very controversial exhibition. It was highly discussed in the local society. It was very critical and controversial, as I said, provocative, probably also with regard to this very positive image of this history, with all this proud of this successful participation in the colonial trade business of the Flensburg city. And then, starting with this special edition, a lot of other endeavors started to develop within the city, and almost always the museum participated in this process. For example, some so-called colonial walks are quite common in the city nowadays. You can get a guide, most of them from the museum, and walk through the city, and they are showing you these, for example, this architecture. This is a West Indian a building in Flensburg, and this is a park named after a very successful merchant of the city. And now you have the signs there, which is much more critically describing the success of this merchant family in Flensburg. Yeah, and then also 2019 there had been a temporary monument in the harbor of the city. You see here, it wanted to express that there is a missing place in Flensburg to commemorate critically the colonial past. And as I said, this was only temporary. It is taken away, and that's why nowadays we have, or there is a temporary exhibition at the harbor. Just a few signs are there, and you get information about the general topic of commemorating colonial past, not only in Flensburg but in Copenhagen, for example, and Hamburg and the vicinity, and other port cities as well. And Flensburg strives to imitate these cities, and that's why just recently, a few weeks ago, there had been a contest pronounced to erect a monument, a permanent monument, and the winner is going to get 10,000 euros. So if you are feeling like participating, you might do so. So this is now going on. Next year there's going to be erected a monument. And now with regard to the museum exhibition, the Maritime Museum, as I said, the permanent exhibition has 3 rooms: an initial room which has more or less just the basic information, which I gave to you as well, just the history of participation of Flensburg in the Danish West Indies. And yeah, here you see this date, and then rather traditional exhibition items. And then you have a second room, which addresses the issue of slavery and as a basis for the economic success, but again from a rather traditional point of view, depicting slaves only as victims and not as agents, as it was done later on in the special exhibition. Sorry, so quite a traditional way of depicting slavery, only. By means of depicting slaves as very passive. And then you have the third room, which is more in the tradition of the very positive image of rum. Flensburg as a rum city. You see, for example, these merchandise signs here, or also this part. And also the very technical approach of how to produce rum, which is also informative maybe, but not very critically. But then you also have a little bit a small place where the racist background of this merchandise is more critically approached by. You see this interesting box, you can't even look inside, so that's why it forces you to think critically about how the merchandise worked. And the most famous example of the racist parts of it is the so-called pot negerlein, this black person who was a very not positive way used as to merchandise these rum products. So there are some critical parts in the permanent exhibition. But as I said, the major step forward in this critical direction was the exhibition by Imani Tafari Ama from Jamaica, as I said. And as you see, the whole ground was similar like a slave boat. Slaves were painted on the floor. And another issue interesting is that there were no usual, like we have it here, exhibition cases where you can read information, but the information was on the ground, so visitors had to bend down, which was a kind of symbolic gesture, of course. So it was very, as I said, extremely provocative, had a lot of visitors and a lot of critical reviews in the newspaper. So this is with regard to Flensburg, and now I turn to Ventspils, which you of course know much better, I guess. And again, I start with a brief overview of the colonial past itself. Interestingly enough, compared to the Danish case, the history of the Curonian or Colandian colony in the Caribbean is older or started earlier. First of all, of course, the Duchy of Coland and Semgallia had to be founded as a result of the Livonian War in 1561 by Gotthard Kettler, and then his predecessor, Duke Jacob Kettler, is well known, I think, in Latvia, and he was, of course, a great hero or the great instigator of the colonial endeavors of Coland and Semgallia. And he very early already started to get a foothold on Tobago, which is located, by the way, here in the south. So we have the Danish Islands here and Tobago in the very south of the Caribbean Sea. And then, in the meantime, he successfully built a fortress in the Gambia River in 1651, and successfully, and in a long-term sense, got a foothold in Tobago in 1654 by the foundation of the Jacob Castle and in the Kurland, or the Kurland Bay in the west of the island. It's located, but as you know, it unfortunately was only more or less a short-term experience. Only after a couple of years during the Second Northern War, he was captured by the Swedes, and then the whole project was slowed down, or Dutch settlers took over the settlement, and later on, when Jacob was freed again, liberated again, he started to rebuild the colony with partial success. So we can describe the story ongoing attempts to establish this colony towards the end of his life, and then by a little bit prolonged by his son. But in the beginning of the 1690s, the last settlers from Kurland left the island of Tobago and was taken over by Dutch and later British settlers. So now, with regard to the commemoration in Ventspils itself, it of course has to be seen in the background of the Latvian memory politics with regard to this topic, and it's very interesting, important to understand that it has its root in the interwar period, like it is often the case, of course, in Latvia, and especially during the Ulmanist time, there was a very positive way to address this topic and to see Jacob as some kind of predecessor of Ulmanist himself, a great leader, and was kind of our colony, a Latvian colony. You probably know the story, and this is, of course, important also because it partially was prolonged or continued to exist also nowadays in the independent Latvia. In the Soviet time, the topic itself was more or less forgotten, but this narrative of great success to have possessed an own colony was kind of re-established in independent Latvia. Again, one case in point, of course, is this stamp from 2001, and also, it was this re-establishing of the old narrative was possible, like is sometimes the case, due to the engagement of exile Latvians. And here you see this example of this plaque on Tobago itself, which was erected in 1978 with a very positive inscription. Also, Latvians are mentioned there. As being active on the island, as I said, erected by exile Latvians, and not very critical, and that's why kind of bridging this narrative into independent Latvia. And another example within the city of Ventspils, of course, is the shopping mall, named also after the former colony Tobago, which is again a very positive way of addressing this issue. And another example you probably also know is the fountain frigate whale, or Struglaka frigate Valsivs, from 2016, which is very nice to see, and very possibly a very nice fountain, but again totally not in a critical way addressing the topic of possessing a colony. And the same can be said with regard to the museum, the Castle Museum. It's, as you probably know, the topic of the colonial possession is hardly addressed. There's only this very small map in one corner of the museum, which is not even a historical document. It's a British map of the island of Tobago, so we would only find the historical names like the Great Courland Bay on this map, but no references to any real history of the possession of the colony, or rather any critical points with regard to slave history or the fightings against the indigenous population or something like this is not shown in the museum, the Castle Museum of Ventspils. Okay, so now I come to the comparison and the conclusion. I think it's interesting that although there are, I think, very much similarities between both cities and the historical past of possessing or being the major port of a small colonial power, Courland in Denmark, the way of dealing with this issue is very different nowadays. Of course, there are differences in the historical past itself, which may cause this difference, but I think it's more interesting and more significant that the whole setting is very different in the memory politics in the recent decades due to the recent history. And the American historian Harry Merritt labeled the phenomenon with regard to Latvia that it's about the colony of the colonized. So the whole understanding of the term colonized and who is the colonized people, of course, differs in the Latvian case much more, because here it's always Russia and the Soviet Union which is the colonizer, and oneself does not see oneself in the position of being the colonizer itself. So it's a very different way of approaching this topic, and that's why the whole post-colonial approaches which were important in the Flensburg case, where the scientific writings are heavily drawing on Homi Bhabha, for example, and the idea of a third space in a museum as a way of unlearning the traditions within the society, which was exactly what happened with regard to this special exhibition in 2017 in Flensburg. This kind of thing did not happen until now in Ventspils, but still I think it's then again a very interesting question as to whether this is possible at all, and by doing so one might think of the idea of traveling concepts by Mieke Baal, the Dutch scholar, that of course it's a very interesting theoretical question whether it is possible at all to adapt the same or to use the same concept in the Latvian context, and I think somehow it would be maybe even a mistake to do so, because as I pointed out, the story in Latvia is of course completely different. There's a different story of the whole understanding of colonization, not only in Latvia, but of course also in the larger context. The same goes, of course, also with regard to Russia, where you also know there is, well, probably do not know, but some maybe know there is significant work written by Alexander Etkin, the internal colonization. So in the whole Eastern European context, the idea of colonization is a completely different one, and that's why I think it would be a mistake, or even, as I said, not possible just to 100% to use the same concepts in the Latvian case or in the Ventspils Museum. But anyway, also because, as I said, the Western European idea strongly draws on the assumption that colonialism and racism is strongly interconnected. But at the same time, I think, since Larry Wolff has written about Eastern Europe and the idea of inventing Eastern Europe, constructing some division between the Western Europeans who are othering Eastern Europeans, I think there is also a kind of hierarchy in cultural discourse between Western and Eastern Europe, and that's why the whole idea of the division of Europeans and non-Europeans is a little bit more complicated with regard to Eastern Europe, and that's why the whole setting is much more difficult in Eastern Europe, which Latvia belongs to, from my point of view, at least in this regard. But anyway, as I said, I think it would be important to collaborate more closely across the Baltic Sea, since both cities are very different nowadays in addressing the whole issue. But actually, as I tried to point out, in historical terms, there are very much similarities between both cities, and that's why I think it would be very promising if the museums would not only the museums, also scholars, would more closely collaborate in addressing these issues, and not only because of the same historical experience or similar experience, but also due to the fact that actually during the early modern time it was not only about colonial trade relations, but of course the Baltic Sea itself was a sea of connection, and the Baltic trade during the time of the early modern period was very intense, and there had been a lot of trade going on between Ventspils and Flensburg even without the colonial trade. So that's even an additional argument to collaborate even more strongly in the future. Yeah, okay, thank you. I hope it was interesting, and paldies par jautājumu.
Thank you very much. Jautājumi?
Paldies, Mārīte Jakoļa un Nacionālais vēstures muzejs. Man, atklāt sakot, nav jautājumi, bet tā ir tāda tēma, kas prasa milzu diskusiju, tīpaši, teiksim, Latvijas vēstures kontekstā. Un mums, principā, pašiem prasās saruna par to, kādā veidā tiek konstruēta šī vēstures apziņa, kādā veidā vēstures mīti ietekmē mūsu attieksmi pret vēsturi, jo šī Kurzemes hercogistas kolonijas, tas ir tāds milzu mīts, ja, kas vēl joprojām latviešos neskapēc uztur tādu lepnuma sajūtu, lai gan patiesībā mēs bijām ne tikai mazākā koloniju zeme pasaules vēsturē, bet arī laikam visīsāko laiku faktiski, jo reāli hercogs Jēkabs, Tobago, teiksim, šīs Kurzemes kolonijas Tobago, tātad pirmais posms no 654. līdz 58. 59. gadam, un otrais posms, no 17. gadsimta 70. gadu beigām līdz šo 90. gadu sākumam vai maksimums vidum. Tātad paši varat parēķināt, cik tur reāli ir to gadu, kad tie kurzemnieki bija tajā Tobago. Vispārējais laiks ir hercoga Jēkaba centieni iegūt starptautisko atzinību, respektīvi iegūt šīs kolonijas, atgūt atpakaļ un atgūt savu juridisko statusu, bet reāli kurzemnieki tur nebija. Un arī par to, protams, vai ne, kārto reizi mēs latvieši lepojamies, mēs kolonisti vai mēs kolonizatori, bet latvieši reāli tur nebija. Tie bija, par kurzemniekiem sauca tos cilvēkus, kuri iestājās hercoga Jēkaba dienestā, lai dotos uz šīm kolonijām. Pārsvarā tie bija karavīri, kas tika vēroēti Vācijā un citās zemēs. Arī vietējie vācieši bija, bet latviešus uz turieni nesūtīja. Un hercogs Jēkabs arī neplānoja to darīt, jo viņš uzskatīja, ka viņam ir nepieciešams darba spēks uz vietas Kurzemes hercogistē. Īsu brīdi bija ideja sūtīt latviešus uz Gambiju, lai parādītu vietējiem, kā toreiz teica, melnajiem un arī zaldātiem, kas tur tika savervēti, kā ir jāstrādā. Jo hercogs Jēkabs vēlējās izvērst šīs plantācijas, ne gluži plantācijas, bet, teiksim, lauksaimniecisko ražošanu Gambijā. Bet, uznāca šis poļu zviedru karš, kas sagrāva visus hercoga Jēkaba plānus, un līdz ar to arī šie plāni palika nerealizēti. Un līdz ar to šī te koloniālā diskursa esamība mūsu teiksim, vēsturiskajā apziņā, manuprāt, tiešām prasa tādas zināmas korekcijas. Tāpat laikā būtu nekorekti pārmest hercogam Jēkabam to, ka viņš, kā saka, vēlējās šīs te kolonijas iegūt, jo tā bija absolūti normāla tā laika, kā saka, iezīme. Ja? Tas bija koloniālisma laikmets. Protams, atkal jautājums par šo te vergu tirdzniecību, ja, kas visiem ir aktuāls. Jā, hercogs Jēkabs vēlējās to darīt, bet viņš piedāvāja Spānijai un citām, kā saka, lielvalstīm, ka viņš varētu ar saviem kuģiem šos te vergus pārvadāt, bet lielvalstīm tas nebija interesanti. Ja, un līdz ar to visi viņa plāni, tur reāli viņš varbūt kādus dažus simtus arī pārveda. Ja? Datu vienkārši par to nav, bet katrā ziņā tie skaitļi ir absolūti minimāli. Līdz ar to, manuprāt, ka mums šī tēma tiešām vajadzētu vienreiz tā kā izrunāt. Ja? Jo kaut kā šie 30. gadu romantiskā pieeja vēstures, kā saka, rakstīšanai, viņa joprojām ietekmē mūsu sabiedrību, ja? un arī šo te pieeju. Tas tāds mans komentārs.
Jā, es piekrītu, protams. Paldies par komentāru.
Paldies. Jā.
Vita ļāva komentāru. Es domāju, ka Mārīte jau ļoti labi teica, tā ir tā mazā dimensija. Vai, teiksim, vai Kurzemes hercogīs būtu bijis kolonizējošs spēks, ja var. Ir cita lielā lieta, un mums laikam Daijas kungs ir arī autori, ja varbūt vairs nav. Tas, ka lielā mērā no literatūras zinātnes tika vēsturē importēts iedziens par koloniālismu vēsturē. Un tagad viņš sakarā ar pēdējā laika politiskiem notikumiem ar šo, teiksim, BLM kustību Amerikā un vispārējo, droši vien, ka arī Flensburgas pagaidu pieminekli un ir saistība ar šo kustību visu ar dekolonizācijas jauno vilni, viņš sasniedz mūsu vēstures lasījumus. Vēsturnieku vidē nē, bet ļoti daudz politologi, literatūras zinātnieki cenš mums uzspiest šo jautājumu par to koloniālismus kā faktors. Arī Timotijs Snaiders pēdējā laika ļoti daudz šādā veidā traktē vēsturi, ka koloniālisms jātiec uz Eiropu. Un es gribēju īsumā pateikt tos 5-6 vēsturnieku argumentus, kāpēc to īsti tā nevarētu darīt. Pirmais tas, ka arī starptautiskās tiesībās profesors Ziemē pateiks, koloniālisms attiecās uz teritorijām ārpus Eiropas punkts. Ja? Juridiski nav attiecināms. Otrais ir politiskā vēsture. Tajā laikā, kad gāja dekolonizācijas process apvienoto nāciju organizācijas vadībā. Tā bija Eiropas atvilkšanās no visām pārējām pasaules daļām. Kamēr Eiropā pašā tieši otrādi tika nostiprināts status quo ar Helsinku lēmumu par robežu nemainību. Un mēs joprojām dzīvojam tajā ciklā, kad mēs sakam, ka Krimē ir jāpiedar pie Ukrainas. Tas pamats arī ir pie 75. gada šī vienošanās par robežu nemainību Eiropā. Un pie daudz kā cita. Lūk, tad nākamais jautājums par Latvijas koloniālismu Latvijā. Mums tā problēma arī literatūra zinātnē, kur raksta cilvēki par to, ka lūk, 700 gadus šo te zemi ir pārvaldījis koloniāla vācisku runājoša elita. Labi, tā var būt, bet tas nekad neiet kopā ar šo klasisko koloniālismu teoriju, ka lūk, tā ir atžgārna situācija, ka it kā, teiksim, šo zemi pārvalda it kā koloniāla elite, kuras metropoli atrodas Pēterburgā. Tā ir fundamentāli pretruna. Kā tā var būt? Ja? Ka koloniāla elite pārstāv kulturāli un reliģiski atšķirīgu metropoli. Tā ir vēl viena problēma ar to, kādā veidā mēs atrisinām. Un pat pēdējā, protams, ir tajā jautājumā, ka, ja mēs pieņemam šo koloniālismu diskursu kā vēstures paradigmu, tādā gadījumā mums praktiski no Latvijas vēstures paliek pāri kaut kādi 50 gadi, kas nav koloniālisms. Pārējais viss ir viens vienīgs koloniālisms. Un tādā gadījumā mēs varam pārrakstīt pilnīgi visu no jauna. Ja? Paldies.
Paldies. Ir jums atbilde?
Man šķiet, ka es nepilnīgi piekrītu, bet arī es domāju, ka mēs varam vēlāk īsāk par to.
Jā, liels paldies par ziņojumu un atbildēm.